In this final video of Lesson 5.1, we will look at manipulating some fractions, having fun with some fractions. So let's get right to it. We've got 1 over 1 plus cosine. And, well, what can you do with that? Well, let's remember that anything times its conjugate is a squared minus b squared. That's the difference of two perfect squares factoring pattern, special factoring pattern. So if you remember that, you might remember, you might get off to a little bit of a head start here. So let's just try something with that and see what happens. So if I want to multiply the bottom by 1, the denominator by 1 minus cosine squared, whatever I do to the bottom, remember the rule is that I have to do the same thing to the top. Because equivalent, this blue fraction is equivalent to 1. So multiplying anything by 1 doesn't change the numeric value, so I can do that. So the numerator is 1 times something, which is, that something. So the numerator becomes 1 minus cosine x. The bottom, though, we need to distribute. Many of us know that as FOIL to help us remember, but it's just the distributive property. So we've got 1 minus cosine x on top. Let's go ahead and do the distributive property here. 1 times 1 is 1. Negative cosine x. Positive cosine x. Negative cosine squared. All right, so we're going to combine some like terms. This ends up being 0. So what we really have is 1 minus cosine x over that's right, 1 minus cosine squared. And now 1 minus cosine squared, do not fall into the trap that I am purposely setting for you. You cannot cancel anything here, even though it looks very, very similar. If this were 1 minus cosine quantity squared, yes, that would be like x over x squared, right? It is not, however, so there is nothing we can really do about it. There's nothing we can do to simplify this thing. Simply because there's subtraction kind of bothering the division. So we'll talk about that in class. Now, what can we do though? Well, in the previous example, we did the same substitution we're about to do now. 1 minus cosine squared is equivalent to sine squared. So let's go ahead and do that again. 1 minus cosine squared is equivalent to sine squared. All right, that's what we took out and moved. And at this point, well, there's not much else to do here. The only other thing you could possibly come up with if you really wanted to force it would be that 1 minus cosine x, that sine squared, could be brought up into the numerator. Where am I going with that? So 1 minus cosine is that. You could say, you could split the division up here into multiplication like this. Sorry, I made a little. Yeah. And then you could, if you really, really wanted to go crazy, make that into a cosecant squared. But as far as I'm concerned, this is no better than that, with the exception of maybe that there's no denominator. So what's the moral of the story? Not every problem, not every exercise ends in one tidy term. So sometimes you can play with things, sometimes you can manipulate things, and you're just kind of caught in no man's land. Like this would be your final answer right here, and that's okay because it is equivalent to the original. All right, so where are we going with that? We're going to do one more example like this, and let me take a second, write that down, and I'll be right back. For our last example, we're going to look at a sum of two fractions. And so let's remember that if we want to add two fractions, we need to make common denominators. And so the product of denominators is always a common denominator. So what I like to do is take this one, put it over itself on the first fraction, take this one, put it over itself on the second fraction, and kind of take it from there. So if we want to add two fractions, no matter what they look like, even if they're written, they're full of, if they're chock full of trig expressions or numbers or whatever, the process is identical. Take this denominator, put it over itself. Take this denominator, put it over itself, and let the algebra take it from there. So let's go ahead and do it to it. So this fraction right here, we've got cosine squared in the numerator, and then don't worry about distributing this denominator. Just keep it as 1 plus sine x times cosine. In this numerator, let's go ahead and distribute. We've now got sine x plus sine squared x. Again, we've got that same denominator. So what now? We can add these two fractions now because they have a common denominator. So let's go ahead and do that. In the numerator, the whole denominator is cosine times 1 plus sine, right? And now in the numerator, we've got sine squared and cosine squared. We usually write the square terms first, right? And then we've got a sine left over. All right, so now what? Well, now we go back to our trusty reference sheet, and by now I hope we all know that sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. Sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. So we can take out sine squared plus cosine squared, replace it with 1. So in this numerator, we have 1 plus sine x over cosine x times 1 plus sine x. And here's why I asked you not to distribute the denominator all those minutes ago. Because now what happens? We have 1 plus sine dividing out 1 plus sine. The reason we can do that here is because the 1 plus sine in its entirety is connected to the cosine of x with multiplication. So now what remains is 1 over cosine x. And where does that take us? 1 over cosine x. The final answer, quote unquote, should be secant x, because, as we know, 1 over cosine is secant.